Okay, good afternoon and welcome everyone to another 5-day seminars hosted by the Center of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Oslo. Our guest for today is Dr. Mary Elston. Thank you, Mary, for accepting our invitation. So I will briefly introduce Mary and her talk today. So Mary Elston is a scholar of Islam. Her research focuses especially on modern and contemporary Middle East, and especially in particular on anthropology of Islam, religious studies, and Islamic intellectual history, with a focus on education, knowledge, politics, and language. And she recently received a PhD from Harvard University, from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, and with a dissertation on reviving Turāth Islamic education in modern Egypt. So I guess the talk you will give today is a spin-off from this research. So in the research, she combines ethnography and textual analysis to examine the politics, text, and practices of traditionalist education in movement at Egypt Al-Azhar. And the dissertation also in 2020 received the Al-Walid Ibn Talal Prize for Best Dissertation in Islamic Studies. So congratulations, Mary. So today, the title that you have suggested for today is Becoming Turāth, right? Tradition in Modern Egypt. We will follow the same format like in our previous lectures. The lecture, Mary's lecture will last roughly 45 minutes, 45 minutes, which will be followed by a 30-minute session where there will be possibility to give feedback and ask questions. So I would kindly remind everyone to please unmute yourself. I would also like to remind that this event is recorded and hopefully it will be published on our YouTube channel with after Mary's consent. So please, if you do not want to appear in the video, please switch off your camera. And thank you very much again, Mary, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. Thank you so much, Teresa, and to the department for inviting me to share my research with you. I'm very much looking forward to getting your questions and I'm sure learning from all of you. So I'm just going to share my screen. Let's see. Hopefully you can see that. Great, yeah. So the title of my talk today is Becoming Turoth, Tradition in Modern Egypt. As the title suggests, I focus on this term, this concept, Turoth, which in English is often translated to mean heritage or tradition. I came to this concept through my dissertation research, where I spent about 2 years total doing ethnographic and historical research at Al-Azhar. In this project, in my dissertation, I investigated a traditionalist education movement that is centered at Al-Azhar, that has the explicit aim of reviving Turoth. So it's through this research that I became acquainted with this term. And so this traditionalist movement is led by sort of a coterie, you could say, of Muslim religious scholars or ulama, including Ali Gomaa, the former Grand Mufti of Egypt, who's on the left here, and Ahmed At-Tayyib, the current rector of Al-Azhar on the right. And so Turoth, I learned during my research, is the central concept to how these ulama and their students conceptualize the Islamic tradition. It's also central to how these Muslim religious scholars construct and defend their religious authority. So my first book, based on this research, will bring attention to this movement, also investigating related debates about religion and politics. But in my presentation today, I focus specifically on this term Turoth. I wanted to bring to the book some kind of historical context for this term, specifically how it is that Turoth became central to the ulama's vocabulary and self-understanding. So in my presentation, I begin by discussing the etymology of this term, and will then trace the semantic evolution of the term through three thinkers. So beginning with Muḥammad Abduh, the late 19th century reformer, and then through Ṭaha Ḥusayn, the 20th century Egyptian intellectual, and finally ending with Ali Gomaa, this important Muslim religious scholar and former Grand Mufti of Egypt. And so I've chosen this particular intellectual genealogy for two reasons, you could say. One is that Muḥammad Abduh is a very important reference, you could say, for scholars such as Ali Gomaa and Ahmed Atayeb. They understand themselves to be continuing his sort of project of tajdeed or renewal. And then Ṭaha Ḥusayn is important because Ali Gomaa explicitly understands his sort of the modern valence of Turoth as heritage. He attributes that to Ṭaha Ḥusayn. So that's one reason for this genealogy that I will describe today. And the other is, I think sort of these thinkers are representative of just these larger discourses in Egypt and how they contributed to the development of this concept of Turoth. So Turoth comes from the Arabic root waritha, to inherit. And when I first began investigating this term, I noted that in pre-20th century dictionaries, such as Lisan al-Arab, Taj al-Arus, Muḥit al-Muḥit, Turoth only has one meaning, which is inheritance. So this could be property, also social status. But it's not until 20th century dictionaries that you find an additional meaning to this term, which is heritage. Tradition is another common translation of Turoth today. So this raised the question for me, how is it that this semantic expansion took place? And so in this presentation, I suggest that the semantic expansion is rooted in the ideas and discourses of the Nahda, the Arab Renaissance, and particularly in the discourses of Islamic reformism as represented by the late 19th century scholar, Muḥammad Abduh. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with him. He's a very well-known figure in Egyptian history and Islamic history. And so I'll just begin by saying that Muḥammad Abduh actually did not himself use this term Turoth, but today I argue that Abduh's ideas about the Islamic past, his particular valorization of the texts of the Islamic classical period, for him the 8th through 13th centuries, as representing the quote unquote true Islamic tradition, was an early manifestation of this concept of Turoth. And I know the idea of the Minervian concept, Einar Wigen, who's on this at this presentation, has developed this idea and where a concept exists before it takes on its particular linguistic coinage. And so I'm going to show you that I think Abduh's ideas are representative of this Minervian concept of Turoth in the late 19th century. So again, as many of you probably know, Muḥammad Abduh was born in the mid-19th century in the Egyptian Delta. He had a traditional education beginning in the Koteb, the Quranic school, going on to the Ahmadiyya Mosque in Tanta, and later to Al-Azhar, where he received the Alamiya degree, similar to the PhD, in 1877. He had a vibrant teaching career, teaching not only at Al-Azhar, but also at newly established schools in Egypt, such as Dar al-Ulum and Madrasat al-Elston. Towards the end of his life, he was a judge in Egypt, and he rose to prominence as the Grand Mufti from 1899 to 1905. So a very central concept for Muḥammad Abduh is that of reform, Islah. And following the thought of his mentor and teacher, Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, Muḥammad Abduh felt that the Muslim world had fallen into a state of decline or weakness. Da'f is one of the words that he uses in his writings. He gives many reasons, different reasons for this decline, but one that he focuses on at length is the state of education in the Muslim world in general, and particularly as it is practiced at institutions such as Al-Azhar. He criticizes the ulama of his day, not only for not teaching modern sciences, but also for their approach to Arabic, which he sees as excessively sort of focused on ornamentation and grammar. But then the aspect of his critique that I want to suggest is most relevant to this concept of Turoth is what he saw as the excessive focus on the texts of the mutaakhirun, the quote unquote later scholars, as opposed to those of the early scholars, the mutaqaddimun, or the ancestors is also the word he uses, as-salaf. And so what Abduh was responding to in this critique was the fact that in the 19th century, most scholarship that would have been taught and produced at Al-Azhar took the form of the commentary tradition, commentaries on commentaries, sometimes on base texts. And in many cases, these commentaries were focusing on texts written in what in Islamic studies is often thought of as the post-classical period, so the 16th through 19th century. And so for Abduh, this excessive focus on these later texts reflected what was wrong with the tradition, that the ulama had sort of come too far from quote unquote true Islam, which really inerrs in the texts of the Salaf, of the Mutaqaddimun. And it's that where you can see that Islam is compatible with reasoned inquiry and with modernity in general. So I'll just read two quotes from Abduh from an exchange that he had with the Syrian Christian thinker Farah Antoun, where Antoun had argued that Islam is not compatible with philosophy and science, sort of following the line of argumentation of Ernest Renan. But Abduh, of course, did not agree. He said, if you look at history, Islam has been very supportive of philosophy and science and sort of reason. The problem is not with Islam itself, it's with the historical evolution of the tradition. So he writes, indeed, the situation of students of the Islamic religious sciences today has come to be that which is lamented in most Muslim countries, for they only read theological books that are compendia of what the later ulama wrote. They study these books as though they were the book of God or the speech of the prophet, peace be upon him. So here he's critiquing sort of religious education in most Muslim countries in the field of theology, kalam specifically, again, for focusing on the texts of the mutaakhirun, the later scholars. And he even says that the excessive focus on these texts suggests that they are approaching them as though they're the Quran or the Sunnah, right? Way too much authority and focus on these texts for Abduh. He goes on to say, each later scholar limits his understanding to the thought of those he follows. He does not pay attention to his earlier forebears. He only considers the utterance and what it presents, such that his status in acquiring the Arabic language falls to the degree of his distance from the early Arabs, until he reaches the state of the people that we see today. They study the Arabic language to understand the linguistic expression of authors in grammar and the arts of rhetoric. If they do not achieve an understanding of what is behind these words, then the sciences of the ancestors are studied, but their skill, sinatihim, is lost. So again, he's critiquing his contemporaries for not looking at the texts of the Salaf, but also he sees this approach to scholarship as very superficial, only looking at sort of grammar and semantics, not looking at what he says is quote unquote behind these words, the reasoning, premises, logic, that for him really reflects the essence of the skill of the ancestors, which for him, again, is reflective of sort of a reason, emphasis on reason, which is very important for Muḥammad Abduh. So even though, again, Abduh does not use this term Turoth, I want to suggest that his conceptualization of the early text, the classical text, is sort of an early manifestation of this concept as it would evolve in the 20th century. And as Ahmed Ashamsi has wonderfully described in his excellent book, Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, Abduh sought to promote this particular conception of Islamic intellectual heritage in his teaching, where he taught many of texts from the classical period, as well as in his editing and publishing endeavors. And then also at Al-Azhar, he was involved in the hiring of 2 professors of Arabic literature. So literature and ethics were very important subjects for Abduh that he felt were not studied enough at Al-Azhar. So one of these teachers, Sayyid ibn Ali al-Marsafi, was a student of Abduh's who would go on to teach Ṭaha Ḥusayn in the 20th century, specifically Abbasid poetry and literature. And so it's through al-Marsafi that Abduh's ideas become influential on Ṭaha Ḥusayn, or one of the ways. But in general, Abduh's conceptualization of the classical period as the golden age that should be returned to manifests in various thinkers and movements in the 20th century. So again, my argument here is that his conception of the Islamic tradition in this way is a precursor to this concept of Turoth. And so turning now to Ṭaha Ḥusayn, I will demonstrate that even though in his early writings he doesn't use the concept explicitly, by the 1930s, it is part of his conceptual vocabulary. And as I will demonstrate, even though his ideas are distinct from Abduh's, his aims are distinct, there's certain similarities in his concept of Turoth and some of Abduh's thought. Let's turn the page. So Ṭaha Ḥusayn, like Abduh, is a very well-known figure in Egyptian intellectual history. Like Abduh, he started his studies in the Kuteb, the Quranic school, and went on to Al-Azhar in Cairo with his brother, who was a student there. But as Ṭaha Ḥusayn describes in his autobiography, Al-Ayyam, he was very critical of studies at Al-Azhar and of the ulama in general. And so when the Egyptian University opened in 1908, he started attending lectures there and was quickly taken by the approach to knowledge and education that he experienced there. So he received his PhD from the Egyptian University, now Cairo University, writing about an Abbasid poet. And then later he goes to the Sorbonne to write another PhD on Ibn Khaldun. And when he returns to Egypt, Ṭaha Ḥusayn is a professor of literature. He's also the first Egyptian to be appointed the Dean of the Faculty of Arts. He eventually is the Minister of Education. He's just a very important figure, especially in the field of literature in modern Egypt. He was a prolific writer, but he was also involved in the collection and editing of manuscripts and bringing manuscripts to print, specifically in the fields of literature and poetry, again from the Umayyad and the Abbasid periods, from this classical period that he thought was so important, as did Abduh. And so in a lot of Ṭaha Ḥusayn's writings, he talks about the importance for modern Egyptians of studying what he describes as al-adab al-qadim, so the old literature or the ancient literature. And in the 1920s, he penned a series of essays called Hadith al-Arbi'a, Wednesday Talk, where he made this argument very specifically, why it was so important to study this literature. But again, in this period, he didn't conceptualize this literature yet as Turoth. So he writes, "We don't want ancient literature to remain simply because it is old. Our proclivity for it is not due to the influence of sentiments of desire and yearning. Rather, we want our ancient literature to remain as a support for culture and nourishment for minds. It is the foundation of Arab culture, and as such, it is a basis for our personality, an affirmation for our nationalism, and it is our protection against annihilation by what is foreign, assisting us in knowing for ourselves." So here, he's interested in the same time period and genre as Abduh was, right? Arabic literature, but he sees it as important for a different purpose. The purpose for Ṭaha Ḥusayn is not religious reform, it's the constitution of culture, thaqafa, and nationalism, right? These are new concepts or emergent concepts at the time, but he's mobilizing this old Arabic literature to sort of forge an authentic identity, if you will, a protection against what is foreign, which at that time was Western. So he conceptualizes this literature as a counterbalance for basically Western modernity in this period. It wasn't until his publication in the 30s of Mustaqbal al-Thaqafa fi Misr, so the future of culture in Egypt, that Ṭaha Ḥusayn uses this term Turoth explicitly in the sense of heritage. And so in this text, Turoth is a broad it's a broad term. It's used, he uses it to express the idea of European heritage, also ancient Egyptian heritage, and as well as Arabo-Islamic heritage or Islamic heritage, a Turoth al-Islami. So in this text, Ṭaha Ḥusayn is making a very explicit argument for Egyptian national identity, which he locates as having its roots in ancient Egyptian history. He's sometimes described as a proponent of Pharaonism, this idea of Egyptian identity in the pre-Islamic period. But he's also making the argument that Egypt should be considered part of the West, that it has more in common with Europe than with the quote unquote East, which for him referred to India, but also Persia and China. And the reason for this is that Egypt has this shared experience of Greco-Roman history or civilization. But in this conceptualization, Turoth al-Islami plays a particular role, which is that he sees it as the link between modern Egyptians and this Greco-Roman civilization due to the translation movement of the Abbasid period. So it's this Turoth al-Islami, which is a constituting aspect of modern Egyptian culture, thaqafa, for Ṭaha Ḥusayn. So even though, like most thinkers of the Nahda, including Muḥammad Abduh, Ḥusayn saw the Ottoman period in Egypt, the 16th through 19th, 20th centuries, as a period of decline because Egypt maintained its connection to the Islamic heritage, a Turoth al-Islami. It sort of maintained its unique Egyptian national identity. So just reflecting for a second, in Ṭaha Ḥusayn's discourses where he's mobilizing Turoth, or expressing this idea of Turoth, he's describing an intellectual corpus that has traditionally been the realm of the ulama. But he's mobilizing it for this kind of secular identity, this kind of secular, if you will, discourse. And I think it's important to note that this concept of Turoth is really not one that was taken up by the ulama at this time, at least in the 30s when he was writing. At least in my research, it appears to be primarily part of these kinds of secular discourses. And I think you see that even though, again, Ṭaha Ḥusayn doesn't use this term Turoth in this 1926 text, Fi Ashir Ajahdi, on pre-Islamic poetry, I think it demonstrates how he thinks this intellectual heritage can best be approached in the modern period. Because in this text, he casts doubt basically on the ulama's methodologies in general, arguing that they are inherently biased, and that the intellectual corpus that is often considered pre-Islamic poetry should actually be approached differently using Descartes' Cartesian methodologies, doubt, and it's through this methodology that he makes the argument that pre-Islamic poetry is actually not pre-Islamic, that it actually was written after the advent of Islam. This is these are very controversial claims. They create a lot of conflict in Egypt at the time. But the important point for Turoth, at least as Ḥusayn articulates it, is that he sees Turoth as something that can be taken out of the realm of the ulama and their approach to knowledge and approached through Western methodologies and used to constitute modern identity. This is sort of central to, I think, understanding his contribution to this term. So in the 1960s, Turoth becomes a very sort of prominent title of a publication series, a prominent publication series called Turothuna, so our heritage. And Ṭaha Ḥusayn is involved in this series as the president of the Arabic Language Council. And between 1960 and 1970, this series published 57 different texts, which I think, reflect very much Ṭaha Ḥusayn's conceptualization of the Islamic heritage that mattered, that is important for modern identity. So most of these texts were in Arabic literature, but also history, language, poetry, and the vast majority of them were from the classical period. So the 9th to 15th centuries, very few texts from the period of Ottoman rule in Egypt. But whereas in Mustaqbal al-Thaqafa fi Misr, Turoth was mobilized to constitute Egyptian national identity, this series is very explicitly aimed at pan-Arabism or Arab nationalism, which was the ideology of the state at the time. And the Ministry of Culture in Egypt was involved in this series. And I've looked at some of these books, and there's various introductions written by the Minister of Culture at the time, Muḥammad Abduh. And so I'll just read this brief excerpt, which illustrates, again, the mobilization of Turoth for Arab nationalism. Indeed, the written word has for a long time been a record of the heritage, Turoth, of nations, a narration of their history. Our current renaissance that sprung up in all fields of life from the dawn of July 23rd, 1952, did not deny the past of our Arab nation. So whereas in the 30s, we saw Turoth mobilized for the constitution of Egyptian nationalism, here it's for Arab nationalism. And the 1950s and 60s, is often considered the heyday of Pan-Arabism or Arab nationalism. And of course, the nadir of this ideology happened in 1967 with the defeat of Arab nations by Israel. And it was at this moment, or afterwards, I suppose, that Turoth really emerged as a central concept in Arab intellectual debates. And this has been fairly well documented in secondary scholarship, where a broad group of intellectuals, often from Marxist, secular, liberal backgrounds, debated the relationship between Turoth, or authenticity, al-asala, and modernity. And so these scholars, these academics came from Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, Syria, and of course they conceptualized Turoth in fairly different ways in terms of substance, and made different kinds of arguments. So for example, Abdallah al-Arawi, who's a Moroccan Marxist, argued that the reason for the Arab defeat is that we're too stuck in our Turoth, we're too stuck in our heritage, and that for Arabs to progress into sort of an authentic modernity, they need to cut ties essentially with this Turoth. And others, such as Hassan Hanafi, the Egyptian philosopher, argues, no, we should not cut ties with Turoth, but we need to reconstitute it, sort of drawing from the traditions that are more reason-based, such as Ibn Rushd, but reconstituting Turoth. And so a common theme in these debates was a critique of the ulama, where the ulama were part of the problem with Turoth. They sort of represented a stagnant approach, I think somewhat similar to what we saw with Muḥammad Abduh. Oh, and I just wanted to include this Google Ngram, which I found just kind of interesting, even though you can only search Google Ngram in English, but there is a very clear uptick in the term Turoth after the 1960s, corroborating what I've observed, that it's after the 67 defeat that Turoth just becomes a focal point of at least academic intellectual discourses in Egypt. But these debates continue to the present moment. So most recently in January 2020, there was a conference on religious renewal where Mohammed al-Khusht, the president of Cairo University, debated Ahmed Tayyib, the rector of Al-Azhar, again about Turoth, where al-Khusht argued that Turoth, again, is the problem, the way that Turoth has been transmitted by the ulama, and it needs to be reconstituted, redeveloped by returning to the hadith and the sunnah. And Ahmed Tayyib argued, of course, that Turoth is not the problem. Turoth is what led to the scientific revolutions in Europe. And so we don't need to reconstitute Turoth, we just need to renew it. But there's another sort of aspect of these Turoth debates in Egypt, which are this question of putative religious extremism, at-tatarruf, which is a very broadly used term in Egypt, often referring to sort of any religious interpretation that is not state supported. And so in these debates, representatives of the Egyptian state, as well as pro-state media commentators such as Islam al-Bahiri and Ibrahim Isa, argue that it is a Turoth al-Islami, specifically as Al-Azhar teaches this heritage, that has led to religious extremism. So the Muslim Brotherhood, Daesh or ISIS, etc. So we see that this concept of Turoth in the mid-20th century was really approached as a resource for constituting modern identities. But in the 70s and 80s and late 20th century, it becomes more of a problem space. Some people approach it as a resource, but others see it as the cause of religious extremism, the cause of sort of quote unquote backwardness. But in all of these cases, we see that a variety of actors, of social actors, not the ulama, are sort of weighing in on this question of Turoth. And in these discourses, the ulama themselves often figure very negatively. So it's in this context that the ulama themselves have taken up this concept, taken up this term, and sought to weigh in order to influence public understandings of Turoth, which I will turn to now with Ali Gomaa, the former Grand Mufti of Egypt. Yeah, so Ali Gomaa is a very prominent Muslim intellectual, Muslim scholar, a Sufi sheikh in Egypt today. He began his education not actually at Al-Azhar, getting his BA in commerce from Ain Shams University, but he eventually does go to Al-Azhar, specializing in usul al-fiqh, the methodologies or principles of jurisprudence, and he is the Grand Mufti of Egypt from 2003 to 2013. Ali Gomaa is a very, he's all over satellite television and social media in Egypt today, and he's become quite a controversial figure due to his positions during the 2011 revolution and 2013 coup, where during the revolution, he was not supportive of the protests, and during the coup, he was supportive of the coup, but also a video was leaked that showed him inciting violence against Muslim Brotherhood supporters. So Ali Gomaa's politics has been a sort of focus of secondary scholarship, but much less attention, I would say, has been given to his conceptualization of the Islamic tradition, and specifically this concept of Turoth. And so he is a prolific writer. He has published numerous texts, and in many of them, or several of them, I should say, he does explicitly deal with this concept. So I've included a few here. He also, like Ahmed Atayeb, the rector of Al-Azhar, he's also recorded videos where he deals with this question, Ma huwa Turoth al-Islami? What is the Islamic Turoth? How should we deal with the Islamic Turoth in the modern day? So we see that the ulama are responding to these attacks, if you will, on Turoth in their publications and also in social media. So what is a Turoth al-Islami for Ali Gomaa? Well, he describes a Turoth as Muslim intellectual production, so human production, really in the classical and the post-classical periods. 1860 is the end date that he gives, the death of Sheikh Ibrahim al-Bajuri, who was a 19th century Sheikh of Al-Azhar. But for Ali Gomaa, it's important to note that a Turoth refers to the evolution of the ulum Islamiyya. This is knowledge as it was produced and transmitted by the ulama. He doesn't sort of recognize a period of decline the way that we saw with Muḥammad Abduh and also with Ṭaha Ḥusayn. And I also just want to note that in his conceptualization of Turoth, he excludes the Quran and the Sunnah because this is a body of knowledge that is given to error, right? Because it's human produced knowledge, whereas the Quran and the Sunnah are not. And so the second characteristic of Turoth for Ali Gomaa is that it's all knowledge that was produced in service, fi khidmat is the expression he uses, to the Quran and the Sunnah. And so he explains by this that on the one hand, you have what we think of as the religious sciences. So Quranic exegesis is an example. It's a field of knowledge that, is very explicitly aimed at explicating the meaning of the Quran for Muslims, or jurisprudence similarly aims to explicate how to apply the rules of the revelation to daily life. But astronomy and these non-religious subjects were also knowledge that was produced in service to the Quran and the Sunnah. So in the case of astronomy, he describes how Muslim astronomers, of course, love this knowledge just for its own sake, but also they produce knowledge to help Muslims to worship better. And then the third aspect of this approach to knowledge is that at every moment it emphasized authentication. Tawthiq is the word that he uses. He explains that Muslims develop mechanisms to ensure that the knowledge being transmitted was authentic, was sort of sahih, was sound knowledge at every level. And so the primary mechanism that he describes is the sanad or the isnad, the chain of transmission, where knowledge is passed from a sheikh to a student, who passes that knowledge to another student once they've become authorized to do so, and that it's through this personalized, sort of embodied chain of transmission that Muslims can ensure that this knowledge that is being passed down is sound. And so from Gomaa's description, we see that this is really an ideal epistemological and ethical configuration. That's what a Turoth al-Islami represents for Ali Gomaa. And in his writings, it becomes very clear that he sees this ideal as a foil, if you will, for modern knowledge transmission, where knowledge in the modern world is not only pursued with the ulama or at the feet of the ulama in the context of modern schooling, but also other interpretations of Islam. The ulama are not at the center. And that's why someone like Gomaa would say you have all of these problems in Egypt today. So Islamism, secularism, atheism, extremism, etc. And so I'll just briefly note that Gomaa and also Ahmed Atayeb have been undertaking this project to revive Turoth by bringing back some of these traditional teaching methodologies in Al-Azhar Mosque. So the study circles, trying to bring back this sort of personal and ulama-centered approach to knowledge. So there's another very important aspect of Turoth that emerges in Ali Gomaa's narration. And this is the historical reality of Turoth. What he means by this, he explains, is that prior to the end of the 19th century, the ulum Islamiyya, the Islamic sciences, existed as a continuing tradition that was constitutive of social life. But through a variety of historical processes and changes, these ulum Islamiyya became constituted as Turoth, as a heritage belonging to the past, rather than a continuing tradition in the present. And I'll just note that this is really a problem for Ali Gomaa. This is part of what he's trying to rectify in reviving Turoth. And to explain sort of the anxiety that he expresses around this, he says that his big fear is that a Turoth al-Islami is going to become like Egyptian hieroglyphics, understood today by almost nobody. And so I'll just turn briefly to the historical narrative that Gomaa sees as having led the ulum Islamiyya to become Turoth, to become this heritage rather than a continuing tradition. And so, as is probably no surprise to students of modern Egyptian history, he begins this narrative with Muhammad Ali, the early 19th century ruler of Egypt under the Ottomans. And he focuses specifically on the new schools that Muhammad Ali established, which were based on European methodologies and subjects. And so the result of these new schools, according to Gomaa, is there came to be two educated elites: the ulama, who continued to understand the ulum Islamiyya, to produce them. And then there came to be those who were the graduates of the new schools who lost touch with these ulum, could not understand them, didn't know how to apply them to social life or daily life, and that this created a conflict in society. But even more concerning for Gomaa and more constitutive of Turoth were the changes that took place under Khedive Ismail. So in this period, Gomaa doesn't focus on education as much as the social changes that took place. So where prior to Khedive Ismail's rule in Egypt, Gomaa describes a society where faith and social life were in harmony. Ittisaq, I believe, is the word that he uses, where the clothing that people wore and the institutions that existed all sort of were centered around worship, centered on interpretations of the ulum Islamiyya that was the bridge between revelation and real life. Under Ismail, this would all change. And so he describes how, for example, the Gregorian calendar replaced the Islamic calendar. Timekeeping practices shifted from quote unquote Arab time to European time. Clothing styles changed. So he gives the example of Egyptians wearing socks, which makes the ritual ablution more difficult, making prayer more difficult. He goes to some length describing the coming of the Cairo Opera House to Egypt, which exemplified this kind of change. So he writes about how elites would go to the opera, and the result was that they would miss the evening prayer, and also they'd sleep through the Fajr prayer because the opera let out so late. But that this led to a kind of snowballing effect in society where the lower classes, the servants, had to wait up for these elites to come home, and little by little, everyone stopped praying. And society became essentially westernized. This is really the process that he's describing. And there were two sort of results. One is that people stopped focusing on Arabic. They stopped being able to understand it in the way that they had. And related to that is they started to sort of a gap developed between them and the Muslim religious scholars. The Muslim religious scholars started to be regarded with some scorn and derision, and knowledge stopped being centered around the ulama, again leading to Muslims not being able to understand the ulum Islamiyya. So we see in this historical narrative that Turoth is really not a neutral term for the Islamic tradition, for people like Ali Gomaa. It, on the one hand, represents this ideal that existed prior to the 20th century, but the word itself also signals a rupture with this ideal, and related to that rupture, the fragmentation of the ulama's religious authority in the modern period. So I'll just conclude briefly by trying to tie together all this material that I've told you, and then I also want to just take my last few minutes to describe my ideas for another book project, which is inspired by some of this research. So I think this intellectual genealogy that I've traced from Abduh to Ṭaha Ḥusayn to Ali Gomaa shows that this concept of Turoth really has its roots in a critique of the ulama, right? We saw that very explicitly with Muḥammad Abduh, who was critical of the practices and discourses of the ulama in the post-classical period, including in 19th century Egypt. And with that, the related valorization of the classical period as sort of representing the true tradition. And then with Ṭaha Ḥusayn, we see this term really coined to constitute secular nationalism. This is not a term that was developed initially through sort of the discourses of traditionalist ulama. And with Ṭaha Ḥusayn too, it's a conceptualization of the Islamic heritage, the realm that is traditionally that of the ulama, but taken out of their methodologies, right? It's this Turoth that can be taken up by non-ulama intellectuals, who can apply Descartes' methods. So it's a term that I want to suggest has this more, you can sort of say secular, but really just non-traditionalist ulama origin. And but it's initially conceptualized as a resource in this very positive way. We saw that with the Turoth series in the 1960s. That, of course, changes somewhat after the 1967 war, where the defeat, where these intellectuals take up this term. It's this concept around which people have a lot of anxiety. Turoth becomes a kind of problem space, something that needs to be solved and figured out in order to forge a more authentic identity. And then, of course, in the 21st century, it becomes connected to the problem of religious extremism, the cause of terrorism, if you will. And it's in this context that the ulama have really turned to defending Turoth, and in doing so, I think reconceptualizing it as an ideal that is really synonymous with an ulama-centered approach to knowledge and education. So I'll just briefly describe, I found it fascinating to look at this history of this concept, which is so ubiquitous in discourses in Egypt today. And it made me reflect on some of the analytical category of tradition that is so ubiquitous in Islamic studies, Anglophone Islamic studies. But also I've become more aware of this very exciting field of conceptual history, but in non-European contexts. And so for my next book project, my hope is to try to put together a conceptual history of, this Anglophone notion of tradition, but through an investigation of the emic terms, the Arabic terms for tradition, as they have sort of evolved in the 19th and 20th centuries, and in the transnational context of Egypt and Syria. So, of course, there are many different terms that do get translated as tradition. So taqlid is an obvious one, Turoth, naql, but also ada, urf, sunnah, hadith. There are so many different terms that have these different particular valences, these particular histories, as I think the term Turoth really demonstrates. So my hope is to sort of be able to trace the semantic networks and diachronic and synchronic evolutions of these terms and their relationships in two ways. The first is a kind of, my thinking is to identify major representatives of some of the important intellectual, religious, political trends in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I've included some of them here to identify what are the terms that, loosely are sort of near equivalents for this idea of tradition, and then to hopefully bring some kind of quantitative analysis to popular discourses, looking at these terms in newspapers and journals. And I'm thinking about investigating the different temporalities that underlie these different terms, so taqlid and turoth, but then also just inspired by Margaret Pernod's work, thinking about the sort of different emotions that can be also connected to these conceptions of tradition. So, just sort of a trope, if you will, is the idea that tradition is like overly emotional, like fanatical, etc., whereas modernity is reasoned and rational. But I think, probably an investigation of these terms and the sentiments expressed around them, or our affects, would actually probably illuminate a very different kind of geography of emotion, if you will. So I'll conclude my presentation there, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for this very interesting presentation, and also for presenting your second book project. So one of the things that I like the most about studies in conceptual history and intellectual history like this is also that they facilitate the discussion of words in original language on a global scale, right? So today I was promoting the event on Facebook, and I found myself, using the term Turoth, in a Facebook status, and I was like, yes, today my entire network will get to know this word. So I have dealt myself, with the concept adib in roughly in the same period. So I find very resonance with your claims today, and I have so many questions that I would like to ask, but maybe I could just start with one, which is also related to your next project that you were presenting, and especially about this idea of translation. So I'm thinking, for example, at what you were saying about Ṭaha Ḥusayn, right, and his use of Turāth. So I was thinking, somebody as Ṭaha Ḥusayn, who, as you were saying, was very fond, in reviving this Turoth, this tradition, but at the same time, he was also quite influenced by Western European debates about tradition and so on. So I was thinking whether his understanding of Turoth is also influenced by European counterparts for this term, and what would be the terms that would be influential in translation for this. And a question connected to that is also, is translation of these terms relevant at all instead for Islamic thinkers like Ali Gomaa?
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think translation is such an important part of this story, and it's something that when I began doing this research, for this specific sort of article that I'm working on, I was thinking I really need to try to figure out, right, like how specifically Ṭaha Ḥusayn, like how was his conception of Turoth influenced probably by European discourses, probably by French specifically, but yeah, I guess in my research so far, I wanted to begin sort of without Europe being foregrounded, I guess is one way to think about it, by looking at the terms as they emerge in the Arabic. But I also just methodologically, how do you pinpoint sort of like, I guess I wasn't entirely sure, and maybe people here, I know there's people here who've done a lot of work on translation, like, how would you illuminate the influence of European discourses on his conception of Turoth? Of course, heritage is a concept that a lot of people have written about, and sort of the emergence of nationalism, not in Europe as well as other places. And it sort of intuitively makes a lot of sense that probably Ḥusayn was influenced by these other, these kinds of discourses. But it's something, I guess, like, it's sort of an edge that I want to work on and to figure out how do you show those connections, in a kind of empirical way without giving too much sort of credit, I guess, to sort of foreign discourses, if that makes sense. And then in terms of Ali Gomaa, I think that's, for sure, he in his writings, he knows certainly some English. He probably knows some French as well. And he's very explicit in some of his writings about the problems that he sees with translation. I remember reading, like, he's like, science is a really bad translation for the word ilm, because ilm has this particular meaning of Islamic knowledge, and like the English word science has all of these different valences. And yeah, again, I wonder when he's using this term Turoth, is he conceptualizing it as heritage or tradition? Is he thinking about these, translations that are often given for these terms? And also, of course, like, especially with this word Turoth, there's so many different discourses that it's actually part of in the Arab world and in Egypt. I mean, one obvious one is just like national preservation, museums, and thinking about sort of ancient Egyptian artifacts and things like that. So I mean, what I focused on today are just sort of this sort of discourse that I think is relevant to this religious genealogy of the term. But I think going forward, yeah, it'll be important to try to bring in maybe some of the like less obvious influences, whether through translation or also through these other kinds of discourses relevant to Turoth.
Thank you very much. No, I understand the difficulty also of trying to preserve the term in original while not giving too much influence to translation. Yeah. In the case of adib, I mean, there were writers themselves discussing who, for example, among the European authors would qualify as an adib. So yeah. So I wonder if this could be one way of looking for explicit references.
Yeah, and well, another idea I had is that you know, I mean, there are places where like the Majma' al-Lugha al-Arabiyya, the Arabic Language Council, where, you know, there's a lot of explicit conversation about neologisms and new terms and their relationship to other languages. And I wonder if looking into some of those discourses would sort of show where those interconnections and the influence of other languages might be in the evolution of the term. So
right, yeah. No, and I mean, this long-term period that you're analyzing makes it even more interesting. So thank you for that. Okay, I have already 2 hands raised up for questions. The first one was Albrecht of Mainz. Please, Albrecht.
Yeah, thank you for a very fascinating talk and very well presented talk, I should also say. That was really, really inspiring. My question is a little bit about, is there or did you come across in your studies debates among those who have a positive conception of Turoth about the canon? You know, canonized, what are canonical texts? Like this series Turathuna could potentially be regarded as an attempt to establish such a canon. Is there an Arabic word for canon, or are debates around what can be canonical, what is regarded as canonical, all led under the term Turāth? And maybe did there ever emerge among those who have a positive idea of Turoth, did there ever emerge a consensus or a rough consensus about what is canonical? Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. You know, it makes me think about this English word canon and, you know, specifically, I guess, how we conceptualize it, right? I mean, are we just talking about sort of like the, you know, most authoritative, like, you know, formative text from the intellectual corpus? But, you know, so maybe there's someone here who will say something different to what I'm about to say, but I think that this term Turoth in its positive valorization with that series Turothuna probably like is the best stand-in that there is in Arabic, at least to my knowledge, for this idea of canon. I think that was very explicitly what they were trying to do with the Turothuna series. And, you know, interestingly, in my investigation so far, I really haven't seen a huge amount of sort of disagreement or debate about what should be part of the canon. Like, my impression is there's really broad consensus about you know, what constitutes the great works of the Umayyad, Abbasid, and Mamluk periods, which were represented in the Turothuna series. And it's something that ulama such as Ali Gomaa totally agree with. You know, like, even though he's someone who first of all sees the post-classical practices and texts in a very positive light, he's primarily interested in jurisprudence. Those are 2 sort of periods and genres that are excluded from the canon, if you will, of the Turothuna series. He still, you know, he is in great broad agreement that like the texts of that series are some of the great works. you know, he's not critical of the specific interpretation of great works printed in that series. But I think it's a great question, and it's one that deserves more investigation, certainly. Because probably, I mean, just sort of intuitively, like, I'm sure there were debates, you know, but I'll just also, just off the top of my head, like, my impression is there were more debates about how Turoth should be interpreted. So, you know, I'm thinking of Ṭaha Ḥusayn and Mahmud Shakir, I believe is his name, this mid-20th century, more traditionalist Azhari, who was very critical of Ṭaha Ḥusayn, specifically for, you know, his arguments on pre-Islamic poetry. But basically they had, my understanding is like they broadly agreed on the texts that mattered, but they had very different ideas about how those texts should be approached in the modern period. So, but thank you for that those excellent questions.
Thank you, Mary. Now the next one in line is Stefan Gut.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I really wish you were here in person, as it used to be in pre-corona times, so that we could extend on our discussions with so fascinating a topic. I try to be very brief. I have two main questions, maybe. One regarding the method. Are you also using IT-supported technology to skim text and word processing methods to analyze the texts and larger amounts of text that would perhaps broaden the picture and go away a little bit from the main persons that we still are using at the moment? And the other question is more content-based to Ali Gomaa. I was very not surprised, but interested in the concept of thiqa or tawthiq that you mentioned, that is obviously connected for him to the concept of Turoth. So somehow the idea of a tawthiq implies that trust has been lost, but I'm not sure if it's really trust, because it's also connected to this. Yeah, you mentioned also the harmony that has been lost between. So it's more the link between the elements of everyday life, and but I wonder whether you can elaborate a little bit more on this thiqa idea and tawthiq. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for those questions. So, and I also wish I were in Oslo in person one day, hopefully. So in terms of the first question, no, the answer is I haven't yet sort of embarked on this more IT-supported technologically oriented investigation, but that is what I'm hoping to become more acquainted with for my second project, which is this conceptual history of tradition. I'm really a beginner learning about some of these technologies, but I think, yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that having a large corpus of searchable text would, I think, illuminate these kinds of concepts and their movement and valences in a very different and illuminating, important way. So yeah, that's something I'm learning about and hope to continue with. And then in terms of elaborating on tawthiq and sort of why he's emphasizing tawthiq in particular, you know, I think that the need for tawthiq for someone like Ali Gomaa is related to, again, this quote unquote problem for him of the fragmentation of religious authority in the modern period. So, you know, whereas the knowledge of Turoth as an ulama-centered approach to knowledge and education is one that Muslims can rely on, right? They can rely on it as being authenticated, as being sahih, due to the various mechanisms such as isnad. it's this reliability that he wants to suggest is really lost in the modern period. That's what the rupture of Turoth has done to knowledge transmission, where, you know, you hear this term fawda, like the chaos of fatwas and iftat, is something that Gomaa and other ulama talk about and write about, the sense that there's, you know, all of these people weighing in and articulating, you know, religious opinions or interpretations of Islam, but in ways that, you know, are not authenticated. There's no process of tawthiq. So I think like that, it really comes down to religious authority and the location of the transmission of knowledge and interpretation of knowledge inside or outside the tradition, which the tradition for Gomaa is an ulama tradition. Like that's it. Those are the boundaries. If you're not an alim, like, you know, this is not authenticated knowledge. That's essentially what it comes down to for him. And yeah, the harmony question is, you know, is related. It's just all part of the ideal that he's painting, where when knowledge is centered around the ulama and their traditions, that's when society, that's when faith and society are in harmony with each other. That's when the knowledge of the ulum Islamiyya are, you know, are constitutive of institutions, educational institutions, but also sort of the infrastructure, if you will, of society. So clothing, time, keeping practices, etc. So yeah, no, it's a very interesting narrative that he paints.
Thank you, Mary. So I see Osama El-Azami has raised up his hand. Please, Osama.
Hi, thank you, Mary, and thank you for sort of Turāth and your colleagues for organizing this. I mean, I have to say that I'm very happy that this is happening online because I'm being mainly from Oxford. But Mary, your sort of presentation was wonderful, and you very kindly sent me your dissertation many months ago, and I read it with great pleasure. I just had a few questions, and I work on sort of similar-ish areas, but I'm interested in thinking about the notion of Turoth across different kind of what might be called Sunni denominations, and I wonder if you've reflected on this at all. To what extent is Turoth a distinctly sort of Azharite concept, or what might be called a traditionalist concept, and to what extent is this something which actually transcends those sorts of categories? So I'm just thinking in terms of you know, other, even between the two figures that you mentioned, Muḥammad Abduh and Ali Gomaa, their orientations to some of these questions can seem to vary, or people who would seem to fall into their orbit. Someone like Muhammad Sa'id Ramadan al-Bouti, a major scholar in Syria, passed away in 2013, but also a graduate of the Azhar. You know, Muhammad Sa'id Ramadan al-Bouti, for example, has suggested that someone like Muḥammad Abduh is was a kind of crypto infidel, you could say, whereas obviously he's someone who's greatly valorized by someone like Gomaa, but you know, Bouti's perspective on Abduh is not unusual in Syria, for example. And at the same time, someone like Muhammad Imara, who again recently passed away, who sat on the Hayat Kibar al-Ulama with Ali Gomaa, is someone who can be very you know, fairly fit into the Islamist paradigm. He's very much interested in the state from an Islamist perspective almost. But he's the one who's, you know, producing the A'mal al-Kamila of people like Muhammad Abduh, and one of these champions of a lot of these kind of quote unquote modernist figures. So I sort of wonder, Abduh's a really Gomaa to me is a fascinating figure because he kind of transcends some of these sort of relatively narrow typologies where you can say, okay, he's a neo-traditionalist, but he's also a heavily statist figure, far more than Ahmed al-Tayyib. And there's been some recent tensions in Egypt over Ahmed al-Tayyib's resisting Sisi's pressure on, you know, regulation of fatwas and things like that. So I just wanted to ask you if you have any thoughts on how someone like Gomaa fits in with this sort of, with these various different strands. And I think there are lots of differences between these figures as well as certain elements that unify. but I hope that made some coherent sense. But thank you very much again for an excellent presentation.
Thank you so much, Usama, for coming and for those excellent questions. And it's so nice when you get questions that, you know, sort of touch on something you've been maybe implicitly thinking about, but not explicitly. So I think that, yeah, just even posing that question to me, because I've been so focused in my research on Gomaa really more than these other figures, it just, you know, of course, there are such important differences between them, even if there are certain characteristics of Gomaa's approach, Bhutti's approach, Ahmed Tayyib's approach, that there are also convergences between them. And, you know, so, I mean, one that I think you do find with all of these figures is this emphasis on the madhab when it comes to jurisprudence, Ash'ari theological interpretations, also the importance of Sufi practices. And at Al-Azhar, you hear this approach called Manhaj al-Azhar, so like the Azhar methodology or interpretation. But, you know, yeah, you point to differences in the relationship to modernism, if you will, and to Abduh's thought in particular. And it's something that I definitely am grappling with, continuing to grapple with Ali Gomaa, because interestingly, both he and Ahmed Tayyib, you know, locate themselves as continuing Abduh's renewalist, I guess you could say, approach, right? Tajdeed is a central concept for them. And yet there are very important ways where their approach is different from Abduh's. And some of the critiques that Abduh made of his contemporaries, you know, are, I think, problematic to people such as Ali Gomaa and Ahmed Tayyib. And you find these traces of a kind of ambivalence, you could say, regarding Abduh in their writings, especially Ali Gomaa. So, for example, in his discourses, Gomaa tends to differentiate between islah, so this word reform, which was a central word for Muḥammad Abduh, and the concept of tajdeed. And so even though, so the difference that Gomaa explains is that whereas islah implies that there's a problem with the tradition, that like mistakes have been made, and is sort of critical in that way, tajdeed, he says, is it articulates sort of a position of reverence and respect for the tradition. And so I find that, I mean, that differentiation is, I just find it really interesting that on the one hand, he wants to present himself, I think, as a modernist, continuing Abduh's approach, but he at the same time is sort of in a kind of nuanced, subtle way, distinguishing his own project from Abduh's project. And yeah, I think it just points to the fact that he wants to walk this line between being a quote unquote traditionalist, right? Someone who represents the tradition, and at the same time, he wants to do so in a way that is also, I mean, you could say modernist, right? Like a lot of his religious interpretations and fatwas have historically, you know, especially in the social realm, come down in more quote unquote like liberal ways. So I think in that way he is an interesting figure. He is different from Ramadan al-Bhuti, for example. And okay, I'm just being a little long-winded here, but basically my hope for this book, my first book, is to include a comparative chapter at the end, in the last chapter, where I address some of the sort of pluralism, you could say, or like the diversity of these different approaches, which, you know, there's certain similarities. You could say they all fit into a kind of traditionalist or neo-traditionalist approach. And yet there are, of course, important differences between them. So anyway, thank you so much for that question. I find it very productive.
Thank you, Mary. We can see that. So I have 3 more questions lined up. So let's see if there is time. The first one was Alp. Alp, please.
Thanks, Teresa, and thanks, Mary. your presentation was still as fresh as if like I was listening to for the first time, which attests to its brilliance. I just wanted to make a few quick comments, maybe to hear your reaction as well. I mean, what strikes me, I mean, even more than the kind of nuances or the transformations in the approach to this notion of tradition or Turāth, is the kind of the similarities between cases, which I brought up with you before, especially with the Turkish case, even to the point of, you know, when such a concept in Turkish emerged in the 1860s and 70s as a neologism. But beyond that, the temporal structure of history or memory that Turāth implies a kind of really is a big question, because I mean, when you especially were talking about how Khidiv's time was a crucial point for Ali Gomaa, I mean, it's a similar case of, you know, how Tanzimat era is damned and really kind of cursed, and, you know, just perceive it as this process of alienation by traditionalists in Turkey as well, coming up with similar arguments. I mean, of course, part of this parallels between the temporal argument implicit in Turāth, both in Turkey and Egypt, is of course translation. I mean, I could at this point safely say, I mean, after listening to you, that the Turkish debates, especially after 1970s and particularly after 1980s, can be considered as a derivation of the Arab debates, because there was so much translation from Arab scholars, from both left-wing Marxist people like Laroui and Hanefi to names like Qutb and, of course, Ali Gomaa. Actually, Gomaa was so well respected, even I remember as I grew up, you know, he could be considered even a Turkish Muslim opinion leader. And I remember meeting a young guy in his 30s who was a very interesting figure. He was a graduate of economics, I think, but at one point in his life, he left everything aside and just taught himself Arabic and started going through Islamic classics like crazy. And he would have these private sermons to young university students. And I had the opportunity to attend one of them. And he was so good at, you know, citing almost from memory, from classical sources, from both, you know, dictionaries, language sources to usul al-fiqh, everything. And I had asked him at one point, you know, I was obviously impressed and I admired, and I just asked his opinions about some of the modern ulama, like from Abduh to people like, you know, Jabiri and Hanefi. And his response was just very clear and clear-cut. And he said, well, I don't read, as a principle, I don't read anything that was written after 18th century. And his explanation was, those are all apologetics, because they are defending, they are in a position of defense. So it's basically apologetics, and nothing comes out of apologetism. So I just ignore all of this.
I'm sorry to interrupt. May I ask you to ask the question so we have time for the others? Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, I mean, that was kind of my. I mean, I was trying to kind of make a point, but yeah, I mean, I just you know, wanted to get the task out of there. I had no real question. I apologize for that.
Well, yeah, no, Alp, I remember before we talked about some of those similarities between the Egyptian and the Turkish context, and maybe we should write an article, or, you know, like, I mean, it's such an interesting, it's just such an interesting parallel. So thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alp. Sorry for interrupting. So, okay, I see Hanada has his or her hands up. And then I have Hussam Alam. Hanada, are you here?
Yes, I am. I would first start by saying thank you for a very lovely, well-lived presentation. It's been a long time since I've enjoyed something, putting these three characters together, even though putting them together is a bit eclectic. Because you can, on the one hand, argue that Muḥammad Abduh and Ali Gomaa have the career resemblance, and while Ṭaha Ḥusayn has a different aspect. He has the Azhari roots, as you well know, but it's somewhat a question mark on putting him there with these two. So this is one thing. And my question is, when you looked for the definition of Turoth and having Ṭaha Ḥusayn is in there, that's the challenge. Because for me, when I read Muḥammad Abduh, I read him as a thinker of Nahda, where Islam and Turoth for him becomes not only a form of, this is religion, it's an issue of identity. It's not only issue of modernity. He faces modernity on the one hand, and he has identity, and there is this issue that risen with Turoth as anti-colonial. So the fact that you go back in a Nahda and you read these traditions and this literature in Islam and you want to be a reformist, it's because you're part of the Nahda influences, or later on, because you also see what the Western education has done by the stay of Muḥammad Abduh and by the friends of Muḥammad Abduh that you know and you've referenced. So I'm wondering of how much of the notion of Turoth has been carried also because of the influenced also by the political notion of identity within a colonial context. And that's my question. Thank you.
Ooh, what an excellent question. Thank you so much. Also, your skepticism about these three figures together, I think is a good point too, honestly. I think that, well, I'll just say that the reason I did mention part of how I came to putting these three figures together is that well, Gomaa himself invokes Ṭaha Ḥusayn as sort of where this term, this modern valence of Turoth comes from. And so, you know, I sort of started by looking at Ṭaha Ḥusayn, and then, you know, it was just very obvious that like his conceptualization of the text of the classical period as the important period to return to, it was building on Abduh. And I was so curious, does Abduh use this term Turoth? And of course he doesn't. So, you know, that's sort of just like methodologically how I got there. But I think, yes, two are alims, right? And then one is really, you know, he's left Al-Azhar. He's super critical of the ulama. But I think that's part of what I'm trying to say about this term, that even though it has roots in reformist discourses from an alim, like I think it really, it becomes sort of coined and popularized not in ulama discourses in the mid 20th century. So that's part of what I was trying to do. But then it gets taken up again by the ulama in the 21st, late 20th century. So, but then in terms of the political, well, there's an excellent, I think it's an encyclopedia entry on the term Turoth as a political concept, exactly as you're talking about, which, what's her name? Yasmin Daifallah is the author, where that's exactly what she's talking about. Maybe you know her, you're smiling, but where she conceptualizes Turoth as this anti-colonial political concept, you know, from the early 19th century with, you know, without its particular linguistic form as Turoth, but this anti-colonial, anti-imperialist concept that's constituting of modern identities throughout this period. And it's just an excellent piece that she wrote. So, you know, I think that's of course part of the story of Turoth. And what I'm trying to highlight in the material that I'm looking at is, yes, there's this anti-colonial aspect, but there's also, for the ulama today, there's this anti-ulama aspect, right? Like that's another part of it. And I think that's what I'm trying to show through Abduh and Ṭaha Ḥusayn, is that it's really a concept that's premised on a critique of the ulama, or sort of a distancing from them, and a taking this intellectual heritage away from them, essentially. So thank you so much. Yeah,
thank you. I agree. will add a little thing is that actually the fact that Ṭaha Ḥusayn was, I don't know the term, but was takfir. The takfiris have reached Ṭaha Ḥusayn, and now they're talking about Muḥammad Abduh. So you can argue that that's also another aspect of how the two of them go together. Despite,
yeah. Well, I mean, so the two of them, I think, just a little side note, I find their place in Azhari imagination and discourses today just super fascinating. I think in 2016, a professor in one of the faculties at Al-Azhar was, I believe he was fired or something because he invoked Abduh and Ṭaha Ḥusayn as sort of the, whatever he was continuing. And, I think that both of them, there's sort of an ambivalence around them in Al-Azhar, because on the one hand, they were critical in different ways of the ulama and the traditionalist methodologies. But then on the other hand, they are held up as these figures of sort of modernism, if you will. And I think their place at Al-Azhar today is, I think it's, there's ambivalence around it. It's not as clear as like, just sort of being criticized or distanced from them. So yeah, anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Mary, if you still have energy, I have one last question by Hussam, who has also started to contribute in the chat. So please, Hussam.
Peace be with you all, everyone. This is Hussam from Al-Azhar. I currently work at Al-Azhar Fatwa Global Center, and also I teach at Al-Azhar University. And it was so great pleasure to have met Mary while doing her PhD here in Cairo, while I was teaching at Al-Azhar Mosque. And it's really fascinating, and I really would like to seize this opportunity to thank the organizers for having this opportunity to listen to Mary and her insightful presentation. Just one of the points that I'd like to stress here is we can also add another layer of complexity to approaching the topic of Turoth, when we also take into consideration that the word Turoth can be translated into English not only, as Mary mentioned, as heritage and as tradition, but also as literature. So this is also one of the terms that can be thought of as an equivalent in the English language for literature, and thus it would also by default or in turn mean that the whole idea of the need to discard or this recent debate that took place between the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar and the head or the president of Al-Azhar University, it doesn't make any sense, because in any academic discipline or any institutional academia, you cannot say that I need to discard all the academic literature that was written and accumulated across the centuries and then start all over again. So this is one of the meanings also that and the points that are also invoked by the scholars at Al-Azhar who clearly state that we cannot start all over again. And as the Sheikh of Al-Azhar said within this conversation, that the word itself of renewal or tajdeed is per se of a Turathi origin. So it is not a modernist endeavor or innovation to come up with the word renewal, but rather it finds its roots in the tradition itself and in the Turoth itself. Another point, and I'd like to also here invite Mary to share with us more her insights on this, as to how the whole debate, especially in the recent, even the most recent time about Turoth, it is actually being politicized, that it has been used for political manipulation in order to serve as a tool of distraction for the public opinions, that there can be some things that are more important, but let's bring this issue of Turoth in order to distract everybody and start the whole debate. So thank you so much, and thank you so much, Mary, for the presentation, and looking forward to your upcoming book, inshallah. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hussam. It's so nice that you attended, and Hussam was my wonderful teacher and guide during my research in Cairo. I think that's so interesting. Yeah, literature, Turoth as literature. I hadn't really thought about that specific valence. So I think that it does add a layer of complexity and is very fascinating. So thank you for making that point. And in terms of sort of the politicized nature of these contemporary Turoth debates, I mean, absolutely, right? I mean, you could interpret them in different ways. You know, what are they trying to distract from? You know, but right, during my time in Egypt, at least, and Hussam, you would know more intimately than I would. Yeah, like Turoth, there's this focus on Turoth in a very contentious way. There are these very contentious debates between Al-Azhar, between the ulama, and these media commentators who accuse Al-Azhar and the ulama of teaching Turoth in such a way that it leads to Daesh and ISIS and sort of putative religious extremism. And it is very easy to interpret that, I think, in the way that you are, which is, with good reason, that it's sort of distracting from maybe some of the larger problems that Egypt is facing today. But I think, I don't think it can only be reduced to that. I think it does touch on these longer historical debates that I've pointed to today, right? Like this question of Turoth has been at the center of different kinds of debates and questions in Egypt and the Arab world for a long time. So, but thank you so much for those excellent points.
Thank you very much, Mary. I also see a comment by Stefan in the chat to check also the Turāth shelf in bookshops. Also, I'm thinking myself also if one could diversify also this debate, including also more secular or female voices. It would be interesting also to look at Mai Ziyada's understanding of Turāth, and this could be maybe for your next project. But thank you so much, Mary, and thank you for staying with us, for waking up so early and staying with us, and also just replying to all this feedback and questions. It was a very fascinating presentation, and I think for the entire group, as you see, I mean, I think the entire group here in Oslo, and also I see elsewhere, also is very interested in this questions. So we really hope to have you here physically in Oslo and continue the debate.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for these excellent questions and insights. I did learn they really helped my thinking move forward, and I just appreciate the department inviting me to present this research, and hope to come to Oslo one day, inshallah.
Inshallah. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining, and have a nice weekend. And related to that also, we have next presentation on Friday is also kind of related to the question that we also looked at today. Is a presentation by Dr. Giedre Sabacevuti. You will forgive me, Giedre, if you're online, for mispronouncing your name. It's about the life of Sayyid Qutb reconsidered. Sayyid Qutb, a poet and an Islamist. So we will continue talking about Egypt and modern debates about culture and religion. So Mary, you are also invited, of course, if you can. So thank you everyone, and hoping to see you next Friday, and have a nice weekend. Bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Mary.